Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to see some familiar faces and some new faces. I'm not sure I'd get up at 6 in the morning to hear me, so I appreciate that, that you're motivated to do that. The subject I called the subject living in the tornado, and sort of how I characterize this last year of my life, and so wanted to talk a little bit about what that's been like, why, how I think a tornado is fitting, tornado, typhoon, hurricane, take your pick. I'm not sure which is quite the best analogy there, but just a little bit about my last year, and then out of that, 3 simple things that I would, sort of say I've really learned to focus on through my tornado year, and maybe they're helpful for you as well. Reasonable? Okay. Imagine, as you go along, you're working pretty hard, right? And anybody in, our industry who's, working and has, other life activities, so, you're working pretty hard. You almost got things under control, right? Barely got everything in balance, and then bam, something happens, right? It's a family thing, a health thing, a project at work, or something else like that. Chaos ensues, right? And then you spend, the next period of time trying to just about get things back under control. Slowly, you sort of put the pieces back together. You're almost back up, where you have your nose above the waterline, and then what happens? The next thing happens, right? Family thing, a work thing, a personal thing, chaos ensues, right? And you see the sawtooth wave, right? You're back in the depths of, being buried, and then slowly over the next weeks, months, right? You almost get yourself back where you have your nose above the waterline again, and then what happens? Something happens again. And, and I guess, what I've realized this last year as I've been sort of, trying to slowly dig out from this absolutely chaotic year is that chaos is the norm, right, not the exception, right? That living below the waterline is the norm, not the exception, and what you have to do is change the waterline, right? And if you're going to assume, right, that you're going to have any kind of reasonable ability to handle the chaos, which is the norm, you have to change the waterline. I was in Japan this past year, and when I was there, I was going to get the name, sorry, I forgot, but a typhoon went over Japan. Okay, so while I was there, so it was sort of fun. I called up my wife and says, "Hey, honey, right, there's a typhoon going over Tokyo, and I'm here," right? She, of course, was slightly worried when I said that, but, so I came out of my balcony. It was a Thursday morning. I came out of my balcony, right, in the hotel, at the Imperial Hotel in Japan, right, early in the morning, like, 5 in the morning in Japan, and it was the most spectacular sight, because literally the eye of the typhoon was right over Tokyo. Right, you could see the full wall of clouds, surrounding Tokyo. It was an absolutely fabulous sight. So I'm here telling Linda how wonderful this is. She thinks I'm going to get blown away or something, but it was absolutely nuts. And I think it's so reminiscent of what our lives are like living in the storm. Is yes, you see the one wall, you see the other. Right, you may have a brief momentary period of respite, but that next period of chaos is just about to ensue. So my last year has been quite interesting. So I've been CTO of Intel for the last 5 years. And CTO, Chief Technology Officer, that's a pretty cool job, right? So people assume you know everything about everything, right? You really know little about anything, but they assume with that title you know everything about it. So it's an absolutely great title. And if you're going to be CTO for any company, pick a better one than Intel. Right, the technology powerhouse, right, of the entire high-tech industry for the last 50 years, right? So if you're going to be CTO any place, this is about the best place to do it. After doing it for almost five years, I was sort of getting, I think, reasonably good at it. Sort of had the group running the way I thought it should. Things were pretty, going along pretty well. In fact, the CTO for Sun, Greg Papadopoulos, I just had dinner with him this past week. He gave me a great compliment. Right, he was speaking. I wasn't there, but several people I know who were there. There was a panel session that Greg was part of, and he said, and right, you could aspire to be like the super CTO. Pat Gelsinger of Intel. And from our direct competitor at Sun, I thought, hey, that was a pretty nice compliment. So I was getting sort of good at this idea of being CTO and doing it for Intel. So with such a great position, why change? What's wrong with you, Pat? Right? If things are going reasonably well, why change? But I decided that one of the things I really wanted to do for Intel was have a bigger impact on our business directly, and some of the frustration was getting some of those technologies, other things that we had underway. So I asked for this job. Okay? And now I run what's called the Digital Enterprise Group. It's about $25 billion of revenue for Intel, so about 60% of Intel's revenue. About 14,000 employees, about 50 sites or so across the globe. And when I recently presented to the Intel Board of Directors, I introduced myself and said, so I own almost all of the execution problems that Intel has had over the last several years. I own the no-growth businesses for Intel. I own almost all of the bad acquisitions that Intel has done over the last several years. So I said, that's my job definition, is making that bad picture better. And it's been a very tumultuous year. When we did this was the biggest reorganization in Intel's history. We just totally ripped up the organization chart for all of the business groups in the company. I started the year 2 in a box with Abhi Talwalkar. Some of you may have heard of him. About 3 months into the reorganization, Abhi decides to leave the company and become the CEO of LSI Logic. Okay, so here we are. We're spending 3 months trying to pull the group together, how Abhi and I are going to carve things up, and make this group work this way. And then voila, Abhi leaves, and now I'm running the group 1 in the box. So now we're going through the whole process again, organization, how to balance things, and so on. And then about 2 months ago, Paul Otellini, the CEO of Intel, decides to make it a 2 in a box again. So now Tom Kilroy has joined me running the group. So now one more time we're deciding how to balance things, slice things, and put it around. And given some of those execution, product issues, competitive issues, you might have heard we have some competitive challenges with people like AMD and I also get to spend an awful lot of time practicing either selling our products or apologizing for our products at Dell, HP, IBM, NEC, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Bull, Fujitsu Siemens, Microsoft, EMC, just to name a few. Last week I was in Japan and I practiced the fine art of falling on one samurai in front of NEC, Fujitsu, and Hitachi. So it's been a very intense, chaotic year, where I've lived more under the waterline than I would have ever dreamed. And through this, I guess there are 3 things that I've been challenged about this last year, struggling with. And often, I've heard it defined that maturity is learning the lessons that you thought you already knew. And, maybe 3 of those to talk about quickly as you're, living in the chaos and what it takes to change the waterline. And the first would be is keeping your integrity through that. And as you're so busy, so chaotic, so challenged, how do you keep your integrity, Integrity, the clear view of the things that I'm doing are consistent with my character, personality, and values that I want to live with. And one of those that was very challenging earlier in the year was interaction with Paul for me. And, if you, this is the book that I wrote, Balancing Faith, Family, and Work. And there's one thing wrong with the book. So, anybody pick out? There's something specifically wrong, as you look at the cover of the book. Okay? Nobody's picking it up on yet, right? I didn't pick up on it. I had it personally reviewed by Barrett, Grove, other people at Intel. But Paul looked at it and it says, from the Chief Technology Officer at Intel. And he says, so, Pat, are you telling, is this now Intel supporting, condoning, encouraging your particular views about the subject? And, now that's a pretty tough question, right, to ask. And, his assessment, and, we went through a long discussion with HR and others at Intel, was in fact that, that's not appropriate, right? And, some of the things I have been doing with regard to, let me say promoting the book, things like that. You write a book, you want to sell the book, right? That's sort of the idea, right? Of some sort. And believe me, writing books, unless you're Rick Warren or somebody like that, is not a profitable endeavor. But besides that, you still, write it with hopes of seeing it progressed. So, Paul asked me to change that. That was pretty tough, right? Particularly since the book has just gone to, and I'm sure those of you would like, so this is the Chinese version of the book, okay, which is published. And now there's about 25,000 copies in Chinese in mainland China now. And I forgot I was going to bring the Korean version of the book along as well this morning. And all of those say, from the CTO of Intel as well. So, and a number of things like that. A very challenging period. And I'll tell you, living in the tornado of this year, keeping your integrity, and at the end of it, Paul asked me to do some things, and it's sort of like, well, he is the authority, right? I'm still employed by Intel, and I said, 100%, we're going to do exactly what Paul wants me to do. So if you have one of these copies of the book, right, you have a collector's item, right? Because in the future, that will not say Intel on the cover of the book any longer. So hurry up, go to eBay. They make great Christmas gifts, and buy up those last few copies that are available.
Why would Intel not want to sponsor that?
Well, that's a question. Questions come at the end, Ed. So you have to wait to hear the other 2 points before I'll address that. So the first point, keeping your integrity. And the thing I would just say I've learned more than anything, through this year is putting those guardrails of responsibility, accountability in your life, right, as you're going through this chaos. Because often after your greatest success is a time where it's easy to have your greatest fall, right? You're pumped up, arrogant, confident, all of those kind of things. I got a big new job, big new role for the company. And living and keeping your integrity in every regard becomes most challenging, right? When you're living in the tornado, when you're under the waterline, and you're having great periods of success. Secondly, is keeping your balance. And, again, you're living under the waterline, chaos has ensued, you're barely able to keep things under control. And Paul approached me over the summer, Paul Odolini, CEO of Intel. And again, you remember I just spent the last 3 months figuring out how to run the group, this big organization, one in the box, so sort of getting that all, so Abby leaves, now I'm running it, one in the box, sort of just about getting on top of the situation, just about, figuring out, how we can go make this successful this way, and maybe even getting a touch personally confident, maybe even a touch personally arrogant about it. Hard to believe, isn't it? Yeah, you couldn't ever imagine that, but anyway, maybe just a touch that way. And Paul approaches me and says, we really should, the job's too big, right? We really should make it 2 in a box again. And we had this discussion when Abby first left. There were no obvious candidates, all of this kind of stuff. Give it a whirl and go for it. And at this point, maybe being a touch self-arrogant, I reacted negatively. Why? It's sort of a demotion kind of thing or anything like that. And and I wasn't too excited about it. And not that I didn't like Tom Kilroy, worldwide sales for Intel, very successful, 20-year kind of guy for the company. So nothing negative with respect to Tom. But, my first reaction wasn't immediately positive. Okay? And I was, concerned about the changes for the group, concerned, yet another set of changes. I, was, getting pretty confident of my own ability to run the organization. And all of a sudden, this challenge came in of running the group 2 in a box again with Tom. And so I sort of, said, no, I'm going to, honor Paul. He's in the role of leadership. These are his decisions to make. Yes, I will, have discussions with him about it. But at the end of the day, yes, indeed, we'll do it Paul's way and what he would like. And at the end of it, what I realized, and now that I've been in it for a couple of months and running the group that way, is I was so stupid, right? Because, I was running so hard, working so long, dealing with so many customer issues to try to do all of that for such an enormous group this way. Paul was right, I was wrong. It was just arrogance, right, on my part about it. And it's been a huge opportunity to, one, run the group better, but more importantly, to put a bit of balance back into my own life. Right, as well. And first day, as Tom got back from sabbatical, the very first thing I did, I thought this was very spectacular myself, right? I took my international travel calendar, right? Tom, first one-on-one with Tom, here's my international travel calendar. I tore it in half and handed half of it to Tom, right? And, I felt great, right? A trip to Korea next week? All yours, Tom, have a good time, knock yourself out. So, all of a sudden, it was this great opportunity to put balance back into my life. Because when you're you're under the waterline, you're running real hard, you're maybe a touch type A, self-arrogant person, what do? You work harder, right? You push a little bit more. You can get just that next little thing done. And thus, as I've gone through the year, I've seen very much that I just need to simplify my life. I need to lower the waterline. My life. I was an elder at our church for about the last 10 years. And, I absolutely, no regrets whatsoever, absolutely good thing to do. And, for those of you who might have, positions, of leadership in the place that you worship and, participate in that way, it's absolutely fabulous. But it's just another thing in my life, right? I like sort of showing up for church as, one of the elders of the church and, seeing the opportunity to lead and influence in other people's lives, but I just needed to lower the waterline. So I stepped back from that this year, right, as, after doing it for 10 years and no longer in that role. I also I've also been part of 2 company boards. So, sort of, having the Superman mentality, I can be a good, venture capitalist and board member as well in my spare time, right? No problem. And step back from those as well this year, right? And said, even though, commitments, requirements associated with both of those, it's just more time. More energy, more effort required to make all those things work. And I just needed to change the waterline, right? And take a number of those things so I could deal with the tornado, to, adjust and accommodate for it. And, amazingly enough, right, I've gotten in more, after simplifying my life in many of these ways, I've gotten in more rounds of golf with my wife this year than I did last year. So, that's pretty good, finding ways to, actually make some of those other things happening. My golf scores still aren't very good, but anyway, we enjoy the time together. So, keeping your integrity, keeping your balance, and finally, keeping your faith. You're busy, working hard, somewhat swamped by all the things going on. And when I made the decision to back away from being an elder this year, I also, we had held a Bible study in our home for many years. I had other extracurricular activities. I was on a couple of charitable boards that I was participating in and supporting, good things. One was a college board, one was a church planting organization, so very active in helping them over time, but it was just too much. Too many things to participate in, so I, stepped back from a number of those roles that I had been playing. And all of a sudden, so I'd stepped back from the eldership. I was no longer, leading Bible study. I was no longer, the, active driver of several of these boards. And all of a sudden, I sort of felt a bit spiritually aimless. Right? Exactly, what am I doing, right, in these regards? Because the things that I was, committed to pursuing pretty aggressively, all of a sudden I'm not doing those. And in fact, Linda came to me at some point, was just really, really concerned. She says, are you distancing yourself from the church? Are you stepping away from your faith? She was actually pretty concerned that I was, losing, some of that connection to my own personal beliefs and commitments. And it was funny because one of the things, if you read my book, one of the things that I talk about in the book is, being a mentor and having mentors. Okay, right? Something very important, and having those solid influences in your life. Well, I have several people I'm mentoring, and if you're, one of those, what you find is I didn't spend near enough time with those people this year. What a surprise! But even worse, the people that were my mentors, I spent even less time with them. Right? And all of a sudden, so I'm not connected with the other elders, the other leaders inside of our church. All of a sudden, we don't have an intimate Bible study group that I'm participating in and leading. The people who I'm mentoring, I'm not spending enough time with, or, spending enough time with those who are mentoring me. And all of a sudden, a period of somewhat aimless in my own faith and my own beliefs as well. Something so easy to do when you're living inside of chaos, when you're living inside of the tornado. So, in the last several months, right, one is I have a new mentor. Someone who, was a former CEO of a major high-tech company who's now my mentor. Because one of the challenges I realized was, there weren't many people who sort of knew what it felt like to be in my shoes. Right, and I felt who could be a good mentor. What is it when your CEO asks you to do something like this? And how, and finding somebody who is very useful. So, finding a new mentor, somebody who could really help and work with me in that regard. And also just spending a lot more time with the minister at our church. Right, regular coffees. He's so gracious to actually get up at 5 in the morning and have coffee with me. Almost as good as you getting up at 6 in the morning to, come and talk with us today. But to really just reaffirm the necessity of, keeping your faith as you're in the tornado, and making sure those firm connections, those firm opportunities for your beliefs, your directions, your thoughts are clearly in place. So, through my tornado year, right, seeing the typhoon pass over Tokyo, right, three things have just sort of been reinforced. And again, these aren't things that were all that new to me, but things that clearly, right, with that definition of wisdom, seem to apply. Keeping your integrity, taking those opportunities, those challenges, those things that would fundamentally question your character, and how do you deal with those? And are you going to approach those and deal with those in a way that has the highest integrity to your personal character? Second is, as you're living in the tornado, change the waterline. Change your life, simplify your life, get things out of it that allow you, right, to not barely get your nose above the waterline when things are under control, but to assume that the next chaos, the next tornado is about to hit, and simplify your life, and put that balance in place. And finally, right, you're so busy, right, your beliefs, your family, your personal direction and faith, making sure that those are firmly planted as you're living in the chaos as well. Keeping your integrity, keeping your balance, and keeping your faith. So those are the things that I've learned through my tornado year, and appreciate the time just to share a few of those thoughts with you. So I think we have maybe 10 minutes or so. We can take some questions now, if anyone has them. And, if somebody asks a question before Ed asks his, that'd be great. So, okay. Sorry, Ed. Questions?
Could you talk about how you adjusted? Talk about, you talked about getting off boards and backing off the church. Have you re-engaged in the church or in any of that stuff as the second guy in boxes come in?
I haven't yet. certainly, for instance, Linda and I participate with a Bible study group at our church. I'm not in the role of leadership for that anymore. She's been a little bit frustrated with me that, we haven't been better about attending, but, somehow when I'm in Japan, I just miss, Bible study. It's just, I don't know. They don't move it to Japan for me. But certainly have, sort of, let me say, found a new balance, found a new point that works there. Also, as I, starting some of the new mentoring relationships, as I said, this one guy, former CEO from the high-tech industry, we've started doing, some particular studies that we're doing together, some materials that we're, sort of going through together, right, which, if, it's easy to put off doing your homework, but if you're on the phone tomorrow morning, right, with a guy who's, going to hold you accountable, tonight somehow it's going to get on your priority list to get done tonight. So, and having those kind of accountability relationships is very powerful as well to sort of make sure you have those connections in place. And, as I've stepped away from a number of those boards and other things that I've been on, obviously I continue to get lots of requests for things, opportunities, things like today to do it. And I've just been much more selective in the kind of things that I pick, but the ones I do, I really want to pour myself into doing a great job, right, and making them very effective. And instead of doing 50 things, do 10 that are really good, right, and that you're passionate and quite enthusiastic about, and making those really great. Yeah. Staying connected with the kids and how I keep them part of my life. You're going to tell me to repeat the question?
Exactly.
Okay, good. It's great. This has been a very interesting year. Our first daughter graduated from college, moved to Barstow, California, the garden spot on the desert, halfway between LA and Vegas, right? So you need a bathroom stop on the way, you stop in Barstow. But she's a 6th grade school teacher there, right? Took her first job down there. So, for her and I, it's been, have I talked to Elizabeth this week? Right, emails, interactions, and so on, and staying connected. She was home for Thanksgiving, real excited to spend time with her at Christmas. Josiah is in his 2nd year in college down in California, William Jessup University. He's so independent, he wouldn't care if we ever called him, right? He's off doing his own thing, except, right, financial matters, things like that, as you would well expect. But it so happens that his school is close to the Intel's Folsom campus. So, I've, for some reason, I've made a lot more trips to Folsom this year, right? And got to see some of his soccer games and so on that he's in down there. And I've just made, I already have two day trips to Folsom planned for the first half of next year, right? Just to go spend time with him. And then with the boys, just finding activities that we have 2 more at home, and finding activities that we like to do together. And so, they're both, I like to play racquetball, so every Saturday morning, I drag them out of bed, we go play racquetball, or, one of them likes to golf, so we go golfing together. But just things that bring us back together on a regular basis, and that, we all enjoy to do together. Yeah. It's interesting, and I think I mentioned this in the book, but for the first 10 years at Intel, I took no vacation, 0. And, why take vacation? If you love what you're doing, why leave it? Right? Hey, and I'm liking it, being successful, working 100 hours a week and loving it, kind of thing. And then, right, an interesting thing happened, and this is one of the wisest things my wife has ever said to me. She says, you may not need vacation, but your family needs you on vacation. It's like, oh, I get it, right? It made a lot of sense when you thought about it that way, because, so on. And since then, I've committed, I take every day of vacation that I'm entitled to for the family. Now, the challenge is when you're on vacation, to really be on vacation, right? So, you got to work pretty hard about, keeping those calls and other things off the calendar. But this year we spent a week in Rome and a week in Bermuda as a family. I'm going to take the week off between Christmas and New Year, so do things, and it's easy. One of the things, that's fun because Linda and I found out how to vacation together a number of years ago, right? We used to argue about vacations, how to do them, and all of that kind of stuff. But now we have perfect vacations. We have a week of Pat, right, which is go, see, do, and a week of Linda, stop, rest, relax. Okay? So, Rome was Pat's week, right? Hey, we're going to get the Pantheon in, and then we're going to go to the Colosseum, and then we're going to get to, Pompeii, and, bang, 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 and then we get to Bermuda. Let's sit on the beach for a while, right? So, we work that out. But, we're just, and, I think there are going to be years or times where you can't do it. But, hey, take vacation. Every day you're entitled to. We have our next sabbatical in 2008. We're going to spend probably 10 weeks in China and do the 2008 Olympics. Right, and so on, and next year we're planning on going to Australia and New Zealand, right, as things. And by the way, the further, Linda really likes looking for places that they don't have internet and cell phone coverage is weak, so, that's good advice as well, so, yeah, okay, yeah.
How does a self-described arrogant person find a mentor?
You ask. Maybe I don't want to repeat that question. So, and I quote, right, how does a self-described arrogant person find a mentor? So, I'd say, most of us have arrogant tendencies. Some of us just let them get out of control more than others. Maybe that's just part of human nature. But how to find a mentor? In this case, I asked someone else to help me. Give me recommendations, et cetera, for people. Because I wasn't finding one sort of in my peer group that was working. So, you might do that. In some cases, if you know somebody, how do you pick a good mentor? I think, look at the areas you want to grow. Here are the areas where you're weak. Here are the areas where you want to grow. Have somebody who challenges you and encourages you. Well, pick somebody who's good in those areas. And then go ask them. Right, and go, pursue them in that regard, right? You come up and you say, hey, Bill, right, I've seen your life, Bill, right? And boy, I appreciate, how good you are in your family, how you balance your work life, right, your integrity and your character. And I was wondering if you might just invest some of your time and wisdom in my life. Now, at that point, Bill is so flattered, right, that just about anything you'd ask him to do, he'd say yes for. Right, but just, at some point, just go ask them the question. Would you invest in my life in this way? Would you help me in that regard? And then make sure once you've done that, you make it a good use of Bill's time. Because if you show up, here are the areas, here are the things I worked on, here's what we talked about last time, here's how I'm dealing with those, I've done my homework and so on, Bill feels good about it. Right, if you show up and haven't really followed up, really executed well, really prepared well for that time, Bill doesn't feel good about it. Not a good use of his time. Why should I invest my precious time in your life if you're not going to take it seriously? Okay, sure.
So in the book, it sounds like that you persuaded Linda early on that your frenetic sort of lifestyle was in fact balanced, or that you were able to achieve balance. How in the world did you ever train her to accept this?
So how in the world did I ever train Linda to believe this frenetic lifestyle was actually good? I'd say, and I view the relationship with Linda as, one of those God-given gifts, if I could, where, she has a strong personality. Right, just strong view of right and wrong, black and white. She's one of those people when the freeway says 55 miles an hour, guess what speed she drives? Right, 50. It's hard to believe that there are actually people like that, but anyway, they truly do exist. And in many respects, I view her as a huge piece of my balance or brake pads, and not that we don't have tough discussions. right, about this, or difficult opportunities. I talk in the book about the at-home chart, right, and keeping grade, and very much keeping track of it, and a number of those things that have sort of helped to be very quantified and specific about keeping in balance. But at the same time, I like being busy. I like having lots of activity. That's me. Right, that's who I am, and if I didn't, execute or live that way to some degree, I wouldn't be using, my character, my God-given talents as well. And so over the years, we've sort of found the right balance, right, the right ways to, yes, spend time together and with family, but her to learn to, give me the freedom to go, pursue that frenetic lifestyle and working through it. Not that it's been easy, and, again, sort of wisdom, learning the lessons you thought you already knew. We get to, the chance to, over and over again, sort of learn that lesson. And it's been very interesting the last year or two, 2 kids out of home, 2 kids soon to be out of home. We're seeing empty nesting in sight. Okay? And all of a sudden, she sees me, I do this, I travel here, I go and do those kind of things, and she's an at-home mom, right? And all of a sudden, as the kids start leaving, it started to make us feel a whole lot more uncomfortable with, okay, now what sort of really binds us together, right? I'm speaking here, I'm flying there, I'm overseas for this and so on, and she's at home to an increasingly empty house. And so we spent a lot of time this year deciding how we are going to stay doing things together, right, as we move to this next phase of life. And, one of the things, she said, well, let's make sure we have hobbies together. I play racquetball. She wouldn't dream of getting on the racquetball court with me, with a maniac like me, right? I ski, right? Well, the blacker the black diamond, the better, right? She thinks that's nuts, right? So that's not going to work. Bike riding, well, I'm either out for a slow ride or, right, she's killing herself. Well, that's not going to work. So we've actually picked golfing as a hobby we do together now. A 4-hour walk on a nice green golf course. She loves it, and as long as I keep my competitive tendencies under control, we actually have a good time. So just finding things that just really consistently bring us together. And, flying and going and seeing our kids. Well, I can be a frenetic going through the airport, and she sort of gets drug along, and we go see our kids. It works out just great. So, some of those things have been important to really sort of, keep the relationship together, keep it solid as well. So, okay. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much.